Good morning. It's exciting to hear about how God's working in people's lives across all of our campuses, and that's really the point of this series. It's us stretching our hearts and our minds to imagine God working in our present circumstances for His glory and for His good. So this was the first week of school for a lot of people, and the topic today is very, very appropriate to that. We're talking about suffering today. So if you had to suffer through traffic, if you had to suffer through classes after having summer where you can sleep in as late as you want, you will relate. There's some suffering that's inconvenient, right? But then there's other suffering that really just rearranges your life, and that's really the suffering that we're talking about today. We're in the middle of a story, and the story is going to end up with David as the king, and it's really the story about how he becomes king and all the things leading up to that. And much of the Bible points to the moment and the thought of David as a king and his descendants and all of that. But we often forget that there's a backstory to that there's a lot of pain in David's life. There's a long time from when he is anointed king until he becomes king. And we're in the middle of that right now. We're really in the middle of one of the darkest seasons of his life where he had a moment of fame. He had a moment where he conquers the Goliath champion guy for the Philistines, and he rises to popularity. And they're singing songs about him. But that ended a long time ago, and his father-in-law, King Saul, is jealous and hunting him, and now it even descends further. We're really in the lowest part of David's story, the lowest part of his life, and I'm actually excited about this, and this is why, because I believe that there are many of us here that we're in that kind of season right now, or we're going to be in that kind of season, we just don't know it yet. We're going to be in those seasons where we're being broken. And I'm excited because we're going to learn some things today that will help us make those seasons fruitful in our lives rather than seasons that destroy us. And that's really the story we see. We see King David, he goes through these seasons and he comes out the other side as a king. Saul, he is going through a suffering of his own making because of his disobedience and rebellion towards God. And instead of it bringing fruitfulness in his life, it brings destruction in his life. And you and I, we don't always get to pick the pain. We don't get to pick what's in our life, but we do get to pick whether it's going to produce these wonderful things in our heart, new fruit in our life, new effectiveness for God's kingdom, or is it going to break us and make us bitter and hurt the people around us? That's the option that we have. So we've looked at a couple of different thoughts during this season of David's life. The first thing we looked at is that these seasons, they help us to face our fear. We also saw that these seasons, they teach us to surrender our future, like Jonathan did. And then today we're going to talk about how these seasons help us to find our refuge. So we are in 1 Samuel 22. We'll begin reading in verse 1, and we're going to learn this right off the bat, that suffering exposes weaknesses that we'd rather hide. Suffering exposes weaknesses that we would rather hide. You know, I'm middle-aged now, and there are seasons where I'm really doing a good job about taking care of my body, and seasons that I'm not. And when I have one of those seasons where I'm not, and then a season where I am starting to take care of myself again, weaknesses are exposed, let me tell you. I don't walk right for a few days. I feel pain in muscles I didn't know existed. And why are they shown? It's because the suffering is exposing those kinds of weaknesses. And in a similar way, that's exactly what is happening in David's life. And so we're at the place where it's all-out war between King Saul and David. There's no pretense. There's no trying to get along. David is running for his life. He has had to abandon his family. He is no longer living in the palace. And this is a chapter of descent. This is a chapter, I picture it this way. If David was wearing armor of his popularity and his resources and all that he has, that's slowly being taken away from him. And by the end of this chapter, it's just David. David with no protection, David vulnerable. That's what we're going to see. So verse 1, then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came to meet David trembling and said to him, why are you alone and no one with you? So David's running, the area he's running to is kind of the no man's land between Israel and their enemy, the Philistines, kind of the borderlands where nobody claimed. And there's this priest there, and David goes to this priest, and the priest immediately recognizes that there's something wrong because David's a man of renown. He's the equivalent of a general. He has been victorious in battle, in many battles, and yet David's alone. David is not armed. He doesn't have any provision, and maybe this priest doesn't know exactly what's going on, but he knows that something is up, and it's probably dangerous, whatever it is. He's trembling. Verse 2, and David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has charged me with a matter and said to me, let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here. So David makes up a story. He's like, hey, I'd love to tell you, but this is top secret. You don't have clearance for this. Saul sent me on this mission and I can't tell anybody, but if you've got food, if you got provision, I really need it. Is that the truth? No, David's just making this up. David's trying to survive. And so he makes up this story. The bread he's talking about, it's the bread that's reserved for the priests. And this bread would be made and it would sit in the tabernacle for a week and then it'd be rotated out with a new loaf of bread and then the priest could eat the old loaf of bread. The Bible was very clear, the Old Testament was very clear that this was not for the common person to eat. But David is so desperate, and understand, this is not a man who has a heart of sacrilege. This is not a man who's like, I don't really care what God says, God will make an exception. No, we read his writings, his heart was to be obedient. But because of the fact that he has nothing and he is starving, he has resorted to eating bread that crosses ceremonial lines, it crosses religious lines, because he's literally trying to stay alive. And so this is going against his conscience, it's going against his better judgment. He's even being deceitful here. He's like, give me some of that bread. So verse 6, the priest gave him the holy bread. For there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. And so you're just seeing David is losing everything. It's David in his most desperate moment. Verse number 8, then David said to Ahimelech, then have you not here a spear or a sword at hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. And the priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth, behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here. And David said, there is none like that, give it to me. Now this is a really interesting moment. Geographically, David is in the same region of where he faced off against Goliath years earlier. And you have to think through that story where he is a shepherd boy who happens to be where the battle's taking place, and he hears Goliath mouthing off to all of Israel and to God. And David saying, who's going to fight him? And the arrangement was made that if Israel sent a champion who could defeat Goliath, then all their enemies would be subject to Israel. And he's saying, why is no one going to fight? And David was very confident because he had faced off against a bear before as he was a shepherd and faced off against a lion. He said, God's delivered me, God's used me. Why? I know that God could use me to overthrow Goliath. And Saul, the man who probably should have been the champion of Israel, he was a large man, he looked like a warrior. He's saying, you know what, David, if you want to do this, I'll okay that. And Saul tries to give him his armor. You remember that? He tries to arm David for the battle, and David refuses it. He's like, I don't know your armor. I don't know your weapons. I know God, and I know my sling, and that's all I need. And David faces this giant who everyone's afraid of with nothing more than a strip of leather, a pocket full of rocks, and a heart full of faith in God. And he overcomes Goliath. But that was years ago. And now David is not so naive. Now David is desperately, his life once again in the same place, his life is threatened But he's no longer the same shepherd boy who's like, hey, I can trust God. I've seen God do big things. I just have to believe in him. He says, do you have any weapons at all? I mean, if you got a sharp stick, I'll take that. If you got rocks, I'll take that. You got a sword? What do you have here? And he's like, it's funny you should ask. I've got that sword that Goliath had. And back in David's interaction with Goliath, they're kind of going back and forth. And David's like, I'm going to take your head off. Remember that? And David doesn't even have a sword. He uses Goliath's own sword to decapitate him. I mean, just an incredible story. The faith he has in God. And now he says, oh, you know what? If you got a sword, I will take that sword. You got Goliath's sword? There's no sword like that sword. Give it to me. And I believe we're getting a picture of not only is David in physical need, where he is really trying to just feed himself, but I believe we're starting to see his faith become a little shaky, a little broken. As this same young man who before was like, I don't need anything but God, is saying, give me that sword that Goliath had. It's kind of a full circle moment. But, and it's not to knock on David. It's actually really encouraging for us. Because the story of David is not the story of like this superhuman who has this incredible faith in God that nobody else has. It's not a person who gets it all right and makes all the right decisions. And so, of course, God's favor was on him. No, the story is a story of somebody just like you and me who sometimes when things get really rough and sometimes the pressure's on, our faith wavers a little bit, our faith breaks a little bit. But what David shows us is not that he had perfect faith, but he put his faith, his imperfect faith, in a perfect God. And today, you might be in here today and you might feel that brokenness in your faith. You might feel that doubt there. You say, yes, I believe, but I also have this part of me that doesn't believe. I have this part of me that remembers the God who knocks giants over, but I also have this part of me that wishes I had Goliath's sword. I'd feel a whole lot more secure. You're in the exact right place and you have the exact right God, because God is not here today and saying, get away from me with your broken faith. He's just asking that whatever faith you have, you put in him. And that's what David does. Verse number 10. And David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. You remember the name Gath? Gath was one of the cities of Israel's enemies, the Philistines. In fact, Gath was Goliath's hometown. I mean, you walk through the high school in Gath and you would see, Goliath, MVP of the basketball team. I mean, this is his place. David killed Goliath and he goes to this place. He thinks that being with the enemies of Israel was safer than being with his own family, Saul, his father-in-law. It's safer for me to run, and I don't know if he's thinking this is the last place people will find me. Maybe he's in disguise, but he flees to Gath. And we read in verse 11, and the servants of Achish, this is the king of Gath, said to him, is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing one to another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. And David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate and left his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? So David he realizes he's discovered. He realizes this may not be as safe as he thought. And it sounds like he's arrested, he's captive, and David just acts crazy. I mean, he lets the drool run down his face. He's scratching and clawing at the walls. His hair's just all wild and all this. And I love what the king says. They bring him before the king. And I love this. He's like, his response is basically, oh, again? He's like, do I not lack madmen? He's like, I got plenty of these people all around in Gath. They're everywhere. And you brought me another madman? No, we are at our quota of insane people right now in Gath, and send them away. I don't know what was going on in Gath. Sounds like it was really rough there at that time. But you continue to see David being humbled and humiliated, where just to survive, he's crossing lines of ceremony and religion and eating bread. You see David where his faith is really crumbling and he's reaching for swords in similar instances where he didn't need a sword. And now you see David acting insane just to try to stay alive. This is as humbling as it can get. And by the time you get to the end of chapter 1, David is not impressive. He does not look like a future king. He doesn't even look like the man he was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. And all that he's accumulated, all that he's accomplished, it's all been taken away. And he's a very, very vulnerable man. And chapter 22 is not necessarily the turnaround. But what we see in this snapshot of David's life is this. We see that suffering exposes weaknesses. And you know, that's not always a bad thing. If you're in that season right now, then there are things about your heart that will come to the surface that won't come up any other way. And part of us making these seasons in our life fruitful is recognizing what happens in our heart when we are running for our life. What happens in our heart when we are threatened and we don't have a weapon? What happens in our heart when we are hungry and we don't have food? What happens in our heart when we are surrounded in a place that's unsafe and we're threatened? And they show where we really are. They expose where our heart is actually weak. But suffering also teaches us to find our refuge in God. Chapter 22 says this, David departed there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was bitter of soul gathered to him, and he became a commander over them. And there were with him about 400 men. Adullam, the cave of Adullam. This is the ultimate in-between place. It's the borderland between Israel and the Philistines. It's the place that nobody claimed. It's the place that if you are looking to run away and not be found, this is where you would go. If you were not welcome in your home, this is a place you could go. If you're running from the law, this is a place you could hide out. It was actually geographically somewhat similar to hill country, where there may not be a lot of civilizations there. It might be really rough terrain. There are lots of caves there, and it's just a place for the people who were cast out of society, and that's where David goes. And David, while he's there, he finds that he's not alone, that there are other people there. It's a place that's spiritually complicated, right? David's going to have some great victories there, but he's also going to have times of faithlessness there. It's a place of desperation. It's a place of stretching. It's a place of unknown. It's a place of danger. It's a place of broken dreams and a dark future. But David walks into this place a broken man, and as we see this story play out over the next several weeks, he walks out a king. He walks in broken, walks out a king. In fact, spoiler alert, these 400 people who he finds there, who are just there, well, they walk in all kinds of situations, but they walk out as what become known as David's mighty men. They become known as heroes, David's special forces. And so this cave, this place of loneliness and brokenness and pain and suffering, it's a place of shaping. And if I could speak that word of encouragement to you this morning, is that if you're in that moment of pain, you're in that moment of shame and brokenness, know this, that God is shaping you. God is doing something. And you have this great opportunity to find that God is your refuge in these moments. David, we have several psalms that David writes during this period of his life. One of them is the 142nd Psalm. And he writes this, he says this, with my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. You know, there was a time in my life I was learning to pray, and someone gave me this model of prayer, the ACTS model, ACTS. How many of you have heard of that before? It's adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication. Anybody here ever heard of that? Okay, anybody here pray? I feel really alone. Okay. Well, it's just like a model of prayer. And it's kind of like if you don't know what to pray, this gives you some steps to take, and it fits in like these nice, tidy buckets, and you give it to God and you prayed. That is not what David is doing here. His model of prayer is crying and complaining and talking about all the trouble that he's in and pleading for mercy. I mean, it's a mess. I mean, this is David ugly crying before God. And he's showing us something really specific. He's showing us that if we want God to be our refuge, we've got to bring him our brokenness, right? We don't get cleaned up to go to God. We don't say, now that my heart's in this really good place and I'm full of faith, now I can go to God and talk to God. Now that I'm doing all the things I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm maybe reading my Bible here and there, and I'm having great thoughts, now is the time for me to go to God. No. God is where we go to get our heart right. God is where we go to get our emotions right. God is where we go to clean up our life. God's the ER. You don't stitch yourself to go to the ER. You go to the ER because you need stitches. And God is that for us. And if you and I are going to find God to ever be our refuge, we've got to learn this. Bring our baggage, bring our mess, bring our brokenness when we don't know what words to say, when we don't have our heart in the exact right place, and we just complain. God is big enough for that. That's part of finding God as your refuge. Don't wait until you feel good and are doing good to go to God. God is where we find those things. And then he says this in verse number, by the way, I just want to say this, like our brokenness doesn't scare God. There's nothing in your life, there's no part of you, there's nothing you've done that you bring it to God. He's like, oh my word, and clutching his pearls. That's not God. He knows you. So bring it to him. And he says this in verse 5, I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Oh, this is so powerful. He's teaching us what it means for God to be his refuge. And the first thing he's teaching us is that we bring our brokenness and we just pour out our complaint, but we bring it to God. The second thing he's teaching us is that we find that God is our portion in the land of the living. That has a lot of heaviness that maybe we don't understand in modern society. But in David's time, your portion was your inheritance. When Israel comes into the promised land, they are given an inheritance by God. And by lots, all the different families are given land. And this is so important to their identity as a family that God made it part of their law that the land would always be in the family. Like if you were in dire financial straits and had to sell your land, you would get it back every 50 years to go back to the family. Your portion, your inheritance mattered. And David now, he's in this place where he is not even welcome in his home country. David is living as a homeless person. He's living in a cave. He has no hope of his inheritance. He has no hope of his future. He has no hope of this thing that was given to his great-great-great-grandfathers that was passed down and given to him. He has no hope of that. But this is what he's found. He says, I actually still have an inheritance. I still have a portion, and I found out that my portion is God. He's saying what I have in God outweighs everything I've lost. The value of what God brings to me and to my life is far more than anything that Saul has taken away. And that encourages us because today, if you have lost everything, if today you feel like you have been abandoned, you feel like you have nothing, I want you to know this. David is modeling a relationship with God that is so real and so rich that we can look at that and say, if I've got that, none of this really matters. Wouldn't you love to have a relationship with God that was so rich in your life that it made everything else seem small? That's exactly what David's talking about. But this is what's cool. He says, you're my portion in the land of the living. He's not saying, well, one day I'm going to go to heaven and that's like going to be better than earth. I mean, that's true, but that's not what he's saying. He's saying, I'm in the place where we're actually alive right now, and I have learned right here, right now, in this moment, in this cave, that God is my portion. And if we are ever going to find God as our refuge, we are going to have to learn, we're going to have to experience what it's like to value God's presence in our life so much that everything we've lost doesn't even seem like a loss. That's what it means for God to be our refuge. And it's really likely for you and for me today, that the part of our life that we most want to escape, the part of our life that is the most uncomfortable, the part of our life that scares us, the part of our life that's most broken, that is the doorway. That's the doorway for you to find God as your refuge, to know God, to experience his presence in your life. It's through that brokenness. And it's very possible that while we're over here praying, saying, God, would you take this cave out of my life? I hate this thing. I wish it wasn't here. If it wasn't here, life would be so good. And God's saying, no, I'm not going to take it out of your life, because that cave is where you're going to find me. That cave is where you're going to know that my presence is enough. That cave is where you're going to detach from the material things of this world that don't satisfy, and you're going to find real satisfaction in me. I would never take away the cave. And the problem is not that God doesn't love you and that's why you're in pain. The problem is that God loves you so much that you are in pain, that he's crafting and shaping something fruitful in your life. He's not ignoring you. He's opening the door and welcoming you in. Just the doorway is suffering. The doorway is hurt. The doorway is loss. Suffering teaches us to find refuge in God. But not everyone who suffers like that experiences God and draws to God and obeys God and loves God. Saul's story is a story of a man who's losing things because of his own disobedience. God is merciful and gives him time to repent, but he doesn't. And rather than his suffering being fruitful, it's destroying him and destroying all the people around him. And that brings us to a dark chapter in this story, the rest of chapter 22. And we learned this, that suffering can shape us into being instruments of refuge for others. There's, just to recap what's happening in chapter 22, there was a man who saw David go to the priest. His name is Doeg. He's a shepherd. He's an Edomite. He's not from that area, but he sees what's happening. And he goes and tells Saul, he says, Saul, I know where David is. There's this priest who gave him provision. Well, Saul gathers together his men, and Saul goes and confronts this priest. And the priest said, yeah, that's what happened. We didn't know that's what was going on. And Saul says, you're going to die for this. And he orders his men to kill the priest and kill his entire lineage, 85 people. And his soldiers are like, no, we're not going to do that. Well, this man, Doeg, he's like, I'll do it. And he slaughters that man's entire family. One of his sons escapes, and his son runs to David. In verse number 23, David tells him, he says this, stay with me, do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping. It's interesting, this man, David, who's running for his life, trying to survive, goes in the middle of a place of brokenness. Guess what he finds there? He finds that there are a lot of broken people in this world. His pain is not unique to him. There are many people running for all kinds of different reasons. He finds 400 of them, and they make him their captain. He runs across this man, and David admits that he was partially culpable for the death of this priest, and he carries guilt with that, but he says, I can't undo that, but what I can do is I can be a refuge for you. I can be a protection for you. And this man who learns to find God as his refuge, he now becomes an instrument in God's hand to be a refuge for other people. And that's the beauty of it all, right? The beauty of the pain we go through and the suffering we go through. What God gives us is he says, I won't waste that. I won't waste that. You will have fruit in your life, and one of the main ways we see fruit from our suffering is the very area that we hurt. God gives grace, God heals, God restores, and God uses us to be a refuge for other people. There are many of you here who you know exactly what that is. You went through a time in your life where you had addiction or you had stubborn sin in your life, and God was gracious and God let you overcome that, and now you're helping others in that same area. Some of you in here, you've gone through financial reversal and you learned to trust God through that. And now you help others to do that. That's what grace is. That's what redemption is. That's what the whole story of Scripture is. It's that we as human beings, we've wandered from God. We're far from God. But God, instead of just saying, I'm done with you, he said, no, I've got this reclamation project in mind. I'm going to take these very people who are so broken and I'm going to give them my grace and pour it all over them. And I'm going to release them in this broken world to be agents of my grace and agents of my healing in this world. And so today, I think a lot of us, we get the idea of saying, okay, I need to go through this suffering well because I want fruitfulness in my life. And so God's shaping me, I can do that. That's not where the story ends. There's one step beyond that. Not only is God bringing fruitful things in your life, that fruitful thing is probably in the area of your brokenness and other people that are broken in that same way that he wants you to help and you to serve and you to be a refuge. And boy, that's what makes a church special, is where we stop pretending that we've got it all together and say, hey, I'm broken. It's just my brokenness is healed a little bit more than yours. And let's together, let's find Jesus and how he strengthens us and how he heals us. And I can't think of David, the rejected king who was anointed, without thinking of Jesus, the rejected king who was anointed. You know what the word Christ means? It's not like Jesus' last name. You know what it means? It means the anointed one. He was the anointed king who was rejected, just as David was. But the story of Jesus is not just that he offers refuge, saying, hey, there's a way you can make it through this, but he offers himself as the refuge by dying for the sins of the world, that everyone can find forgiveness in him. And the gospel is not this. This is not the story today. When you face hard times, then go through it because there are good things on the other side. That's not the story. The story is that there's a king, Jesus, who welcomes the frightened and the broken and the bitter people to himself, and he is a refuge for us. Just put our faith in him. That's the story of the gospel. And so how do we apply all this? Well, one is we stop hiding we stop hiding. When we're going through those seasons of loss and suffering, we don't have to pretend that everything's okay. We don't have to tell everybody I'm better than I deserve when we're not better than we deserve. We don't have to say, if I were any better, I'd think I was you. Well, if we don't really feel that way, we can be honest about our brokenness because that's the work of God in our life. Secondly, we learn to make God our refuge by pouring out our complaint, pouring out our brokenness, and also seeing God's presence as more valuable than what we've lost, and we become a refuge for other people. That word refuge, it came to my mind a few years ago. I told you a story about where I met the tallest man in Texas when I was hiking. Well, that same hiking trip, it was actually my 45th birthday, and there were 2 days to it. One day we hiked up one part of the mountain, and we came back the next day. We came back down, and we reloaded up our water, and we repacked our bags, ate lunch, and we head up the Guadalupe Mountain. And that's where we met the ladder guy. And so we hiked all day. We got to our place that we were going to camp for the night. It was right on this exposed ridge. You're close to the summit. It's about 8,000 feet altitude. And it's beautiful, but there's just nothing there. You're like on this edge. In fact, I've got a picture of it. I think I've got a picture of it. I may have a picture. I may not have a picture of it. There's a picture of it. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful area. But boy, the wind was just whipping. And it was a cold spring day. In fact, I wanted to make sure I was not exaggerating to you. I pulled the weather report for that day. And on that day, that place, it was sustained winds of 35 miles an hour with gusts of 55 miles an hour. And likely there were gusts up to 70 miles an hour that weren't recorded. The wind chill that night was 28 to 30 degrees. It was cold, it was windy, and we were up there. We'd been hiking all day, and if you've been hiking all day, there's nothing more you want to do in a cold evening is get into that warm sleeping bag, and you just sleep so well. And so I was watching the sunset. This is the picture I took by the two guys I was traveling with. They set up their tent. They had a 2-man tent they were sharing. I snore like a lumberjack, so I had my own tent. And they had theirs all set up, and we'll get to that picture in a minute. And they get theirs all set up, and it gets dark. I was soaking in the entire, the sunset. And so I'm setting up in the dark. I get my poles out and have my tent poles all set up. And then I go and I grab my tent, and it's not there. I had left it in my car when we had lunch and repacked our bag. I climbed all the way up the mountain without a tent. There was no room in their tent for me. They had 2 guys in a 2-man tent, and they were bigger guys, and they were like, this is gonna be tough. So this is what we came up with. Their tent had this flap on the edge of it. You can see it right there. It's like this triangular flap, and it's meant for your luggage. If you stake it out, you can maybe cover a bag or 2 under there, so if it's raining, your bags stay dry. You don't have to have them in the tent with you. They said, this is what we could do. We could turn the tent so that the wind's not blasting you, and we could kind of try to wrap you up and cover you the best we can by staking this flap over top of you. And so this is me. Yeah, you can see my feet are sticking out the bottom of it because it's not meant for a human being to be there. It's literally meant for like 2 or 3 bags. And they were about to stake the front of this down as much as they could. There's a gap of about 18 inches around the bottom of it. It's just meant to be a rain fly. And they zipped up their side of it so they could stay nice and warm and no wind would come in there. And there I was. This was the night of my 45th birthday, by the way. And have you ever been there where the people around you are like sleeping really deep and snoring, and you're just like not sleeping? And that was me. I'm over here, I'm wedged there. Literally that tarp is like smashing my face in. And I had to position my mouth so I could breathe like from the gap in the bottom, and the wind's wrapping around the tent, and my feet are sticking out and freezing. It was the worst night of sleep I've ever had. In fact, I didn't do very much sleeping. But I did a lot of thinking and a lot of praying that night. There's really not much else to do. And one of the words that came into my mind was this word, refuge. Refuge. Like how much different my experience would be if I just had a little bit of protection. If I just had my tent, I would be sleeping as deeply as the guys next to me, snoring softly. And instead, I'm suffering. And I realized that's exactly how I relate with God so much. He promises to be this refuge. He promises to protect us. He promises that he is reliable and dependable, and I can put all my faith in him. But I go through my life, and I leave God in the car, and I find myself settling for far less than my privilege. I settle for a little flap of a tent to protect me from the winds and the issues of this world, where he promises me the whole thing. What David says is, I found that God is a refuge that's good enough. One of the Psalms that David wrote in this season of his life was one of my favorite Psalms, the 34th Psalm. This is what he says. I think David had a turning point. Because listen to his words. I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces shall never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Lord, help us today to find refuge in you, not to keep it an abstract idea that you're like a refuge, but to truly experience what it's like that the creator of all is dependable and reliable, and inviting us to bring the most broken pieces of our life to him. God, would you help us to do that today? Would you help us to cast everything on you, to depend on you, and find that you are our refuge? Amen.